preaching professor at Pepperdine knew I was using a microphone, he'd fail me.
Oh, no.
There we had to stand on the platform in the auditorium, and he would sit in the very back row, about, I would guess, 150, 200 feet away. And if he could not hear you without electronic magnification, you couldn't pass. His lesson was, project, project. So if I talk a little loud, it's because of him. We can blame him. Okay. Our text today comes from the 15th chapter of Acts, verses 1 through 5. If you care to follow along, you can pick that up. I will mention it as we go along. But I want you to think the good old days. Oh, wasn't that great? Things were so much better then, and if you don't think so, just ask someone who was alive then. It's kind of a variation of the old adage that the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. But when you get to that other side of the fence, you generally discover that the grass there is just as brown as you thought yours was, and that lawn has just as many weeds, if not more, than you had on your own. But what exactly would we find if we were able to go back to the good old days? In the Back to the Future movie, what our hero Marty McFly finds when he goes back in his DeLorean time machine, which took him from 1985 to 1955, certainly wasn't what he expected to find. We really don't know what he expected. Just that what he found wasn't what he thought it was going to be. There was definite culture shock as he saw the gasoline attendant come out and pump the gas, check the oil, wash the windshield, check the air pressure in his tires. Now, when was the last time you saw that happen? Then there was the discovering all the stories he's been told about his parents, about how they had met, lacked a lot of truth. He saw how his father had become a wimp that he was in the future, and how even his normal 1985 clothing was considered outlandish by the people of 1955. Even if Mr. Strickland at the high school didn't seem to have changed much in 30 years, it seemed everything else had. It didn't take Marty long to realize that things were vastly different than what he had been told or expected. And he wanted to go back to the future he really knew. Now, if you could go back to some point in your past, say 1955 like Marty did, what do you think that you would find that would be different then than what you had been told or remembered? Would you have culture shock like Marty? And after living back there for a week like Marty did, do you think you might want to really go back to the future, that is to this present day? After all, back then there were no cell phones, no computers, no 50-inch flat color TV screens, no heart bypasses, no laparoscopic surgery, no miracle drugs, no hip or knee replacements, no polio vaccine, no microwaves, and very few freeways. Gas was only 30 cents or so a gallon. The Dodgers were still in Brooklyn. The Giants in New York. There was no Super Bowl. And professional athletes actually had to work at another job during the off-season to make ends meet. Things also seemed much simpler then. Boys used the boys' bathroom and girls used the girls' bathrooms. And there was no such thing as a government-declared gender identity crisis. It didn't cost an arm and a leg if you were hospitalized, and doctors still made house calls. There were no mobs up in arms over some war or marching for gay rights or same-sex marriages. Now, except for the lack of medical advances like bypass surgery and miracle drugs, I think I could be very content to return to 1955. Although I admit I will miss 50-inch TV screens that are color. Today, there are all sorts of examples of people wanting to go back to what they think they remember the good old days were, but these individuals are not the first to long for what they thought were the good old days. We find them in the New Testament. We find them in the world in the 60s, in the 70s. We find them in almost every decade of history. And we also find them in the church in almost every decade. Actually, we can find them everywhere and every when that we look. But what effect would going back to some former era have on this era? Dr. Brown told Marty not to interact with any of the people who he knew in the future for fear of destroying the space-time continuum, whatever that is. But it was too late. Marty had already discovered how Biff's bullying had caused his father to become such a wimp in the future. He had already followed his future father and saved him from being hit by a car. And then him, instead of his father, had ended up in the house of his future mother. And when she had found herself strongly attracted to him, it made her want to continue to interact with him. Marty tried to avoid any contact with her after that, but circumstance or fate kept injecting itself into the picture. And these occurrences, by changing certain seemingly minor events, almost caused his entire future life and family to disappear. Now ask yourself, if you knew you could change your present situation, would you want to go back in time in order to have something about your future change, even if you didn't know what it might be that would end up being changed? In the movie, all the changes that Marty brings about by interacting with his future family, acquaintances, and so forth turn out to be beneficial. That was necessary for the movie to have a happy ending. But just considering the laws of probability, if we were able to go back and change something, the odds are things would turn out not just different, but worse. For just like Marty, we would have no idea of what changes our actions would bring about. Another movie, The Final Countdown, dealt with the possibility of a modern aircraft carrier with modern weapons and jet fighters being mysteriously transported to 1941 right before the attack on Pearl Harbor. The climax of the movie has the commander of the carrier aware of the flights of Japanese planes on their way to attack Pearl Harbor. He has the ability to prevent the attack, but he sees the mysterious force which transported his ship back in time again approaching his ship. He can choose to prevent the attack by attacking the Japanese planes, or he can recall all of his jets so that the ship can be removed from the 1941 Pearl Harbor equation. Even knowing what the future is going to be, he opts to return to what turns out to be his exact future, and he lets the Japanese attack proceed. I have to say, if I had been that commander, I believe I would have opted to destroy every last one of the Japanese planes on their way to attack the ships at Harbor and Pearl Harbor, even though I have no idea what it would do to the future after that point. I do know that particular action would save thousands and possibly millions of lives. As our text from Acts 15 tells us, one of the first problems which arose in the early church were certain new Christians who had been born and raised as Jews and had a strong Jewish history, wanted to go back to the past that they thought they knew. And by insisting that the newly accepted Gentiles had to follow the same rules, they had to be circumcised and follow the law of Moses just as they had to do. They didn't want to go to the future. They wanted to go back to the past, the way they thought it had always been. We know the first converts to Christianity were Jews. The apostles had all been Jews, as had Jesus. It was only natural for those first converts to equate Christianity with Judaism, as they saw that the life of Jesus fulfilled all the Old Testament requirements of his birth and earthly mission. They knew of the prophecies concerning his death, burial, and resurrection. Of course, they didn't understand them, so they rejected him as the promised Messiah because he wasn't the Messiah that they were envisioning, but he was the exact Messiah God had promised. So when it was made known to those first followers of the way, which what the first Christians were called, that Peter, through a vision from God, had God's acceptance of the Gentiles demonstrated to him, and then preached the gospel to them, and they had accepted Jesus, and then had the Holy Spirit fall on them, it was only natural that those who had grown up in Judaism would believe that the same rules applied to them and have applied to them as Jews. And those Jews wanted to go back to those conditions. This was such a problem that the apostles who were still in Jerusalem had to convene a special meeting to explain that the old law had been fulfilled in Jesus, and what they wanted to return to was no longer valid. It really no longer existed. Throughout history, there have been men in churches who wanted to go back to the good old days. One of the first was Martin Luther, who wanted the Catholic Church to return to what it had been several hundred years earlier. And when the powers that be denied that desire, he tried to start a reformation of the church by posting his 95 Theses on the door of the Wittenberg Chapel. Instead of his call for a return to the good old days, resulting in a return to the customs of the previous centuries, it became the future and resulted in the start of a new church which still bears his name to these days. In the Middle Ages, there were many who tried to reform the church from the inside. Names from church history such as Zwingli, Wesley, and Savonarola, and others. Some wanted to return to a central authority. Others wanted to improve upon Luther's changes. But none of the changes went far enough to take the church back to what Jesus and the apostles had started. In the early 1800s, a man named Campbell finally realized that this was not going to happen. He was instrumental in starting what became known as the Restoration Movement. He and others like him realized they could not reform the church. The existing form was too deeply ingrained in the minds of people. This meant they had to scrap all that they were used to and restore the church to its original form. That meant going back, starting from scratch, and rebuilding the church from its original biblical blueprint in order to achieve what the church had been originally. And they succeeded. What started in 1806 and became known as the Cane Ridge Revival saw literally thousands and thousands come to the Lord. But Satan was very upset. Too many people were hearing the gospel and responding to it. So it was time for him to again get men to believe that traditions were more important than biblical truth. Also, if people were going to be interested in what God wanted them to do, Satan decided to lead certain individuals to claim that they had a new revelation from God. This muddied the waters for those looking for the truth, because they wondered, was this a new doctrine from God? A new revelation directing them to Him? Those who studied the Bible knew it was not. Paul warned them about doctrines contrary to what the other apostles had proclaimed to them. He specifically stated in Galatians 1:8 that even if an apparent angel of light, claiming to be from heaven, proclaimed something different from what they, the apostles, had taught, that angel should be eternally condemned. So where does that put the so-called angel Moroni, who Joseph Smith said appeared to him to reveal God's new revelation? But there were many other false doctrines put forward in the 1800s. Not only did that era see the origins of the Mormon Church, but also the Christian Science Church, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and others, which did not attract as many followers as they did. Satan even managed to divide the Restoration movement into 3 separate parts. And today we have atheism, Scientology, and secular humanism trying to get people to abandon the gospel of Jesus Christ. There are still others today who want to change things in the church. And this does not necessarily mean doctrine, but whether they want to go back to the way they were told or remember or think things were when they were younger. They want to use hymnals instead of singing off-the-wall music. They believe singing should be accompanied by a piano or organ, not a guitar or brass instruments, and especially not drums. Oh, heaven forbid. forbid. So what if drums and brass were part of the worship in the Old Testament? Their answer is that doesn't apply because we're New Testament now. Now it's relatively inconsistent in their logic. The people who want to return to the worship style of the 1950s say we can't use brass or drums because they were the Old Testament way of worshiping, yet they say we should use pianos and organs because they are traditional. Guess what? They didn't have pianos or organs in the original New Testament church. So if they use them now, it can be said they're not following the original New Testament pattern. One of the main instruments they rail against, the drum, was used extensively by the early Christians. It wasn't until the 1700s that pianos were used in churches. Prior to that, the harpsichord was the instrument of choice. The use of organs predate the use of the piano by several centuries, but they were not widely used because of the complexity of the instrument and the difficulty in finding trained players. And also the cost of the organs also played a major role, so they were pretty well confined to large cathedrals. So the good old days of the apostles and the use of instruments in the church is not what many people want to go back to. And most would find even the church of the 1950s era is not what they think it was. Jews wanted to go back to the rules of the Mosaic Law, animal sacrifices, specific penalties for specific violations of the law, dietary restrictions, and adherence to all the traditions which had accumulated over the centuries since Moses. The apostle told them these things could not forgive sins. Going back meant no forgiveness of sin, as only the blood of Jesus could completely blot out and cover their sins. Would I want to go back to the way church services were in 1955? Honestly, my answer would have to be a conditional yes. I am not a fan of repeated choruses, not a fan of 30 to 45-minute song services, in which most of the congregation is simply an audience for the worship team. I'm not so fond of what they call teaching dramas. However, I would not want to be trapped in the old 45 to 50-minute sermon era of the 1950s. An old preacher I knew here in Florida had a saying, "If you can't strike oil in 20 minutes, stop drilling." To which I have to say amen, although I'm a little longer than 20 minutes today. But I must say this. If off-the-wall music, dramas, brass instruments, and drums, long music sections, use of worship teams, and such can reach more people than what might be considered the good old days of worship services, then we have to make the change. Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 9:22, "I have become all things to all men, so that by all possible means I might save some." Too many people don't want to follow that advice. Too many of those who long for the good old days in church want those who they save to like the same things they do and think the same way they do. Unfortunately, most are more concerned with their comfort in church services than in reaching the lost. And that is not only unfortunate, but contrary to the instructions that Paul gave the Corinthians that I just read a few seconds ago, and the instructions that Jesus gave the apostles in Matthew 28:19. Do those who want to go back to the way things were done in church in 1955 really think that that will do more in reaching the lost and benefit the kingdom? Or are they just nostalgic for the way things used to be? You know, one thing I have noticed about life, most of the things I find myself remembering were the good things. I remember periodically seeing people saved in church services I was part of, but I rarely saw as many people come to the Lord at any one time then as I have in some of the congregations using more modern methods today. Marty was surprised to discover how what he had done in the past positively affected the present. I suspect if the commander of the aircraft carrier in the final countdown had really thought about it and considered what he knew was going to happen, he would have destroyed the Japanese planes on their way to Pearl Harbor and wouldn't have cared one bit about the space-time continuum, whatever that is. I have to say, this is kind of an aside that I stuck in here afterwards. After working on this message, I came to the conclusions that churches have failed to go back to the New Testament pattern for church growth laid out by Jesus in Matthew 28. Jesus told his disciples to A, make disciples, that is, introduce them to Jesus, B, baptize them, and C, teach them all things, doctrine. But most churches today are doing it backwards. They try to teach all things, doctrine, then they baptize those who have managed to stay around, and finally they introduce them to Jesus. And I wonder why they don't grow like the early church did. Now I have to say this about Richard. I believe he gets it. And I think Glenn does too. Well, what else I want to say about them? Richard is very fervent about the program of what we call roadside baptism. Glenn is extremely fervent about introducing people to Jesus. Does that sound familiar? Isn't that what Jesus laid out? You know, they know if someone knows enough to want to be baptized, they have already know enough about Jesus to make that decision. And then Richard leaves it up to the local churches to follow up and teach them all things. Teach them doctrine. He is still working to reform the church these days. They say that hindsight is 20/20. But to that I would have to realize that foresight is extremely blurry. If those who want to return to the good old days of church worship services could look into the future and see what their actions are doing to the efforts of the church to reach the lost, would they still long for those good old days? Would I like to see the service and retail practices of 1955 that Marty saw return? Of course I would! But I would not want to lose all the technology and benefits of today. I'm alive today due to many of those technological benefits and advances. But if it would help to reach the youth of today and expose them to the gospel of Jesus, I'm about to become radical. I would say go back then. But if it would reach more of the youth today, and here comes the radical thought, people, I would embrace putting Bible-themed video games into churches. I would, to paraphrase the words of Paul, want to become all things to all men, that I might by some means save some. And if that meant going back to the ways of 1955, so be it. But if it meant changing methods, not doctrine, so be that. Unless something really against all the laws of physics happens, we can't literally go back to the past, but the future is rapidly coming at us every day. We have to plan for it. But we can't effectively plan for the future. We are constantly longing for the way we think it was in the good old days.